This is Hope Incorporated Australia. We engage with citizens and communities to help achieve better, responsible environmental protection and stewardship, locally, nationally and globally. We work from and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Gayabal, Jadawa and Yugara peoples of southeast Queensland, and we acknowledge our deep respect for the inspiring, protective nature stewardship carried out by First Nations communities around the world for thousands of years. A warm welcome to Imagining 2040 Pathways to Flourishing Futures, a podcast from Hope Incorporated Australia. I'm your host, Andrew Nicholson. In this digital space, we want to reinvigorate the often overlooked power of public imagination and future visioning. Our own vision for this podcast project is to help grow a creative, values-driven community of imaginative, bigger picture thinkers, people who collaborate, share ideas, and help map plausible, credible pathways towards futures that will be climate safer, properly nature protected, socially more supportive, and economically fairer in the share out of resources, futures which will leave no one behind. Each episode will offer simple but energising future visioning exercises designed to spark your imagination and help you picture what a thriving, more inclusive and sustainable future could look like for you and your community. Because the future is not a fixed destination. It is being shaped every day by the decisions we make individually and collectively. Together we can choose to make different future development decisions that serve the many, not the few, and we can push harder for the major system-level changes needed to make those better futures real. Over time, we hope imaginative, citizen-generated, visionary thinking can help amplify public calls for a just transition toward flourishing future development and fuel the push for the major progressive reforms needed to get there. Our pilot episodes explore some of those future reform possibilities in education, in citizen involvement in development planning, and in environmental protection advocacy. If you like what you hear, we'll expand the series with more visionary topics and voices, and we'll keep inviting your ideas, your input, and your imagination to help shape our future direction. So, put on your imaginative future vision thinking caps and join me and my guests as we chart positive, credible pathways toward a flourishing 2040 and beyond. I look forward to your company.
In my work and in my research, I'm looking at a strategy that involves simultaneously resistance and vision and bringing them together into a massive campaign. And in order to drive government and other decision makers, we need to create a very powerful community force. Individual community groups, environmental, human rights, peace groups, on their own are not powerful enough to move government in most cases. But if they form alliances to tackle the methods of state capture and to argue for the visionary society, then I think we have a chance.
In this episode, we explore one of the big picture questions shaping our development path going forward, and that is, who gets to define progress and who really benefits from it? Because our progress into the future isn't just something that happens to us. It's the result of decisions made on the back of competing ideas, values and stories about how the world works, how it should work, and who will get the lion's share of the rewards of human progress. But that contest of ideas, values and visions about the future is far from balanced or fair. Powerful vested interests with lots of money and political influence often dominate the conversation, promoting development paths that serve themselves primarily, while further damaging nature and natural systems and deepening economic and social inequality. So how might we push back against this currently dead-end path into the future using our imaginations? Can we imagine effective ways to better challenge self-serving, damaging vested interests and dismantle their roadblocks? Can we imagine how such actions could help move us onto different development paths toward possible futures that would be climate safer, properly nature protected, socially fairer and genuinely more prosperous, futures which left no one behind. My guest today, Dr. Mark Diesendorf from the University of New South Wales, has spent a lot of time exploring such questions and developing powerful and inspiring answers and solutions to the challenges they pose. During our discussion, he unpacks what it might take to confront and dismantle some of the roadblocks to achieving genuine human progress in a way that serves the many, not the few. So a warm welcome, Mark. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, thank you, Andrew. By way of introduction, my name is Mark Diesendorf. I was originally trained as a physicist, a theoretical physicist, and that's the pathway that got me interested in energy, and eventually I became interested in the energy transition, although this was long before 47 years ago, long before the term energy transition had been coined at all. And I've worked on the energy transition on and off since 1978. And the more I worked on energy, I came at it as a physicist, but more and more that I worked on it, I saw that it's really an interdisciplinary area. It involves science and technology and economics and politics and anthropology, and so on. And I gradually took an interdisciplinary approach then. And one of the things I realized is that although technological change is necessary to protect our environment, to avoid dangerous climate change, or at least to minimize it, technological change is not sufficient. I found that we need a much broader transition to a sustainable future, that we can't totally solve the energy problem within the energy sector. And in a sustainability transition, we need to consider socio-economic aspects and political aspects, as well as technological. And this then led to more recent work where I've been involved in critiquing conventional economics, because conventional economics is based on exploiting the planet, destroying the environment, and exploiting the vast majority of people. So my present work is on the sustainability transition, on ecological economics rather than conventional economics, and on trying to further develop the requirements of a sustainability transition.
Thanks for that great introduction, Mark. You know, the gold standard on interdisciplinary, interconnected, joined up, holistic, to use that term, approaches to the work you've done. And one more opportunity to thank you for coming into the Imagining 2040 podcast series. You are a person, it's fair to say, who's been on the landscape for a long time, to put it that way. And just to say that listeners can follow up on your very extensive background research work and career interests through the episode show notes links that we're going to put in there. So Mark, just building on that excellent introduction into our conversation, can you say some more about how you developed those interests? You've already started pointing to that, but tell us more about the energy, the passion that you've brought to your work that you're doing in 2025. Also going forward, how do you see that work helping us get onto possible better development paths which could take us toward the sort of flourishing futures that this podcast series is all about?
Well, I got involved in the social implications of science and technology very early on. I was secretary of an organisation in Canberra called the Society for Social Responsibility in Science, and we were looking at the social implications of science and technology developments, and that brought us into many of the big debates. The French were testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere at the time. We got involved in the nuclear debate, nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and always I had a sense of injustice when I saw some of the establishment views being pushed, which I knew were dishonest. So that, for example, we were being told that the nuclear weapons tests were harmless, that there would be no implications. In fact, the head of my school at the Research School of Physical Sciences at the ANU, Professor Sir Ernest Titterton, he was also on the Radiation Safety Committee, and he was on the media all the time playing down the dangers of radiation fallout from the French nuclear tests in the atmosphere. And very cheekily, I appeared on the radio contradicting him and pointing out the quite substantial radiation doses that were brought down in rain in North Queensland, for example. So my interests developed with a sort of ethical component to them. And the more I looked at the energy transition, the more I realized that the technological change, which was necessary from fossil fuels to renewable energy and energy efficiency, the technological change was necessary but not sufficient. And a simple example is that if we look at the global total final energy consumption of the whole planet in the year 2000, it was 80% of that consumption was fossil fueled. Then if we jump forward to 2019, just before COVID hit us, in 2019, despite the enormous growth of renewable energy, total final energy consumption on the planet from fossil fuels was still 80%. Now, how's that possible? Well, it's possible because of the growth in energy consumption, which is driven to a large degree by the growth in economic consumption. And that told me that I really have to get involved in the whole economic question, the critique of conventional economics, the belief that endless growth on a finite planet is not only feasible but desirable. And so that brought me immediately into the debates about economics and some of the other assumptions of economics, the notion that wealth trickles down from the rich to the poor. Well, there's lots of studies that show that that is untrue. The notion from conventional economics that we should all leave our major socio-economic and political changes to the markets. The problem with that is, of course, that it's really leaving it to the 1% of people who actually control the markets. Markets aren't genuinely free except for the very rich and powerful. And what I found is that we need an economic system that is different from the conventional system, which focuses on economic efficiency and markets. We really need an economic system that gives priority to ecological sustainability and social justice. We need an ecological economics, which is a transdisciplinary field which has been developed over the past several decades and is now morphing into a social ecological economics, because we can't really separate social justice from environmental destruction. One connection is simply that most of the greenhouse gas emissions are actually emitted by the rich. The richest 10% in the world are responsible for half of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And so social justice is linked strongly to environmental protection, and we have to deal with them both together. And I should say at this point that individual action that we do in our homes and working places, individual action is, of course, important. It has educational value, and within community groups, it gives community empowerment. So it's very important, but it's not going to solve the problem because we exist in a system that limits what we can do as individuals. For example, a large proportion of Australians rent their accommodation. And unless we change the system where landlords and landladies are required to make the rental properties energy efficient, then tenants are going to have to waste a lot of energy and emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So systemic action that is actually political, is absolutely essential. And then we come up and we must identify the barriers to system change. And I argue, and others argue, that the principal barrier is the political power of vested interests like the fossil fuel industries. The fossil fuel in addition to the fossil fuel industry, the property industry, the weapons industry, the gambling industry, they have enormous political power. And so we have to examine the sources of their power and how we can combat them. And the way in which they influence and capture the nation state, so that government policies very often favour the rich and powerful vested interests.
You know, Mike, I'm just so struck. There's so many ideas that come out of that for me, but I'm so struck by the fact that, you know, given the longevity of your research background, you know, going back 30, possibly 40 years, how sort of consistent some of the themes have been. I mean, you started talking there about nuclear power and the sort of furphies that were being put forward, the sort of falsehoods there. And of course, we're still in that debate for different reasons around nuclear. You know, can it provide energy? Can it? And it's still a political football. It's still being massaged for, you know, public consumption in terms of propaganda and all that. That lovely phrase, I think it sums up a lot for me. It's almost a mantra for our time: necessary but not sufficient. I mean, you could say that sort of characterises our whole society, really. Tinkering around the edges of major challenges, kicking the can down the road, whatever sort of metaphor you want to use, versus achieving substantive reform. Major systemic reforms that are required. So a lovely sort of overview there, anchoring to your very long-standing research background and interests. And as I said before, listeners can tap into some of that stuff via the show notes. But Mark, now let's move on through this episode into the somewhat the imaginative core, we might call it. This is the part where we get to think beyond the business as usual future, which to some extent you've been pointing very aptly to there in that previous segment. The business as usual future of worsening environmental decline, growing inequality, increasing political instability. In other words, the failing future we seem likely, unfortunately, to be heading toward if we just keep on doing what we've always done. Instead, I want you to imagine, and I know you've already started to do this, but I want you to imagine even more strongly different kinds of futures which are climate safer, nature protected, socially fairer and genuinely more prosperous, futures which leave no one behind. I've talked about this topic of possible futures contrasting to failing futures in greater detail in the series introductory episode, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, I'd recommend going to check that out. But right now, Mark, I want to ask you to do something a little imaginative, a little out of the box. I want you to imagine it's the year 2040, 15 years or so from now. I want you to imagine that although we haven't got a crystal ball, somehow you've had this amazing time machine type of process that's taken you to 2040. I want you to picture that when you're there, you've been observing all of the stuff that's been going on in the intervening 15 years. And you can see that it's now a flourishing future, or at least it's moving in the right direction towards becoming a flourishing future in 2040. And you know that because you can see and sense it's climate safer, fairer, greener, and more genuinely prosperous in a way that I've already started to point to there. It's a future where no one is being left behind. And in the imaginary 15 years or so between 2040 and now, you can see that a lot has obviously changed. I mean, it goes to some of those big picture reforms that you were talking about. They actually took place in our imaginary scenario. Big progressive reforms had clearly occurred, reforms that made a measurable difference to reducing and adapting to climate disruption, reforms that greatly increased protected natural areas and overall tree cover, reforms that ensured affordable housing, excellent universal basic service provision for all. All that stuff was in place. And now, while you're in that better, flourishing, thriving future, you imagine that you've written a personal report. And in that report, you've captured all the inspiring things you saw, the progress, the innovation, the increased well-being all around you, the overall better quality of life for humans and more than humans. And then you've managed to travel back to today in 2025 to share that report with us. So the question, Mark, can you give us a bit of a summary on that report now? What did you experience in that more flourishing 2040, well-being centred future world? What did you see, hear, experience? Give us an impression.
Okay, well, thanks, Andrew. Well, I stepped out of my time machine and started to explore. I arrived in a city I didn't have a lot of time there. My time was limited, so I couldn't actually go out into the countryside. So I'll give you more of an urban picture, but maybe that doesn't matter because I learnt that, in fact, most of the population actually was living in cities now, leaving the rural areas, the natural areas to recover and recover from deforestation, from assaults upon the soils and waterways and so on. So what I saw wandering around one of the cities of the future society was first, it wasn't a utopia. A utopia, of course, would be a fantasy, but it was what I thought was an achievable future. And I was very pleased to learn that 90% of the electricity was now from renewable sources, and they were heading for 100% within a few years. Urban public transport was transformed. Much better public transport within the cities, together with cycleways and pedestrian areas, and that meant much fewer cars, much fewer heavy vehicles also in the cities. And I learnt that urban transport and urban consolidation and urban planning had been planned not by the developers, which seems to be the current situation in Australia, but by the community working jointly with government. And so we had urban consolidation that was, in fact, very attractive, environmentally sound, and very practical in terms of transportation and greening of the urban environment. Going into the homes, there was no gas heating or gas cooking. The cooking was all done by electric induction systems. Heating and cooling was done by reverse cycle air conditioning, all powered by renewable electricity. And there were fewer cars on the roads. The roads were quieter and they were a lot safer. And what cars we saw were electric also, and so were the trucks. I didn't see people sleeping rough, and that was a very refreshing change. And I learnt that that's because public housing had been greatly increased, and those public houses, incidentally, were energy efficient and water efficient to a high degree. And more generally, as you've mentioned, universal basic services, there was an emphasis on public transport, public housing, public education, public health service with community public health centres, public parks, public libraries, and a real transformation where the government, advised by the community, played a much greater role and the market played a much smaller role. There was also much better childcare and aged care. And in the business and industry world, there were many more cooperatives, that is, businesses run by the workers themselves. So a transformation had occurred. It wasn't a utopia, it wasn't a perfect society. It was a society in transformation. And then, of course, we have to ask, well, what was done in that 15-year period to actually get to that visionary future in 2040?
Mark, thank you so much for that very detailed report. That imaginative time travel journey, perhaps not so much a case of back to the future, but rather back from the future. But seriously, what the exercise shows is that we can use our imaginations to help us visualise a better, more flourishing future and work toward achieving that. And we're going to come back to that topic very shortly. But just to pick up on a couple of the points you made there, this is not about creating a pure fantasy world or a utopia, but rather starting to create a plausible, credible, imaginative vision, a roadmap into a possible better future anchored to expert knowledge and lived experience, of which, you are a manifest example. We can start to create such visions of possible better futures and produce imaginative roadmaps to help guide us in the right direction to reach them. And you're going to talk about that in a moment, but perhaps we just need the motivation to look ahead more often with imagination and ask, what if we chose a better path? Anyway, before we get to that final debrief on your report, I just want to do another quick debrief here, and that is to make sure that you are back in 2025 and not suffering too badly from any time jump effects. So just for the sake of the exercise, Mark, what year is this?
I am back in 2025, and I have to say I'm shocked to be back, because I'm back in a world that is facing existential crises, very serious crises. Climate change is galloping out of control. Other environmental destructions, water, land use, the atmosphere, you name it, are really creating existential threats to our survival and the survival of many other species. Social inequality is getting worse in terms of poverty, in terms of lack of housing. The threat of war, even nuclear war, is very real. And we're seeing the loss of human rights everywhere. Now, I just say this because I also recognise, having come from 2040, that we can tackle these problems, but we can't tackle them individually. We need to tackle them together. And as I've mentioned earlier, they are all linked together. For example, remember the link between environment and social justice. The richest 10% are responsible for half of all climate change and other environmental impacts. And the other main link is that the driving force, the principal driving force of all these crises, is the enormous political power of the very rich and of very large corporations, the powerful vested interests who have captured our nation state and most other nation states and are basically controlling what governments do, whether they're governments of the right or the left. So this raises the question, as I stand outside my time machine back in 2025, what do we actually have to do? And I see our response, which we've hinted at already, as having two main components. Resistance, which involves resisting and combating state capture, and we can do this by challenging its methods like political donations, revolving door jobs between decision makers in government and the vested interests, concentrated media ownership, so-called think tanks funded by the vested interests, consultancies, and so on. We can identify those methods. So resistance is important, but resistance has to be motivated by the vision, by a visionary approach. And that's why I'm really pleased that you gave me the opportunity to travel to 2040, because there we have a vision that involves technological change and a transition to universal basic services, and I should add, also a job guarantee, because what I saw in 2040 was not only were there no people sleeping in the streets, but I also saw that everyone who wanted to work could work. There was a job for everyone. And that's not as difficult as it sounds. I mean, even during the peak of the COVID pandemic, we had a discussion in government about a job guarantee for farmers. Now, that was a rather special discussion, and it never really eventuated, but it indicates that when the crises become serious enough, perhaps we can act. So I'm arguing in my work and in my research, I'm looking at a strategy that involves simultaneously resistance and vision, and bringing them together into a massive campaign. And in order to drive government and other decision makers, we need to create a very powerful community force. Individual community groups, environmental, human rights, peace groups, on their own are not powerful enough to move government in most cases. But if they form alliances to tackle the methods of state capture and to argue for the visionary society, then I think we have a chance to actually push government, often very reluctant government, to move onto a pathway which gives us ecological sustainability, better social justice, more human rights, and a more peaceful world. It won't be a perfect world, but it's got to be better, much better.
Mark, once again, fantastic. Thank you for that. You've really outlined there an ability to push society toward the future. You saw in 2040 some practical steps. And I know that you've covered that sort of stuff at length in recent books and recent research papers, so you may have something to say about that as we come into this next section, which is this idea of signals of the future. It's another form of imagination use to explore plausible possible opportunities to achieve more flourishing futures, but this time by looking closely at what's already happening now, for instance in 2025. Because when we do look around us, we can often discover inspiring new initiatives, case studies, proofs of concept, bold ideas, genuinely bold ideas, which if taken forward, if promoted and implemented, could lead us to far better development outcomes. Such opportunities can be considered early signs or signals of possible futures. They may be considered like whispers of change or pointers to the kind of future we'd actually like to see more of over the next 10, 15 or 20 years and beyond. So one question here becomes, what if we could identify and amplify those signals? What if these signals, these opportunities, these most promising, progressive, future-facing ideas and initiatives were supported, strengthened and multiplied? And I know you are, to me, a prime example of having developed signals for the future in terms of your work. But a specific question for you now, Mark, is within your own area of work or expertise, are you seeing any early signals of the future, or have you produced some early signals of the future which could lead us toward more flourishing development paths by 2040?
Well, I really see two types of signal. I see action at a community level. And as I said before, that's very important, but it's not going to be sufficient. And it started probably with the growth of community renewable energy in Europe. In Denmark and Germany, there was enormous growth of community projects, and governments weren't as hostile as perhaps they've been in Australia, because the European countries, well, particularly Denmark, didn't have such a huge coal industry, for example, which has had a terribly negative impact on the energy transition in Australia. So we've seen community renewable energy growing first in Europe and then to some extent in the United States, and now quite a number of community renewable energy projects in Australia, and that's really encouraging. But my main concern at present is trying to change the system. And here we are still at a much earlier stage, because the community projects very rarely, just rarely, lead to system change, except in very small ways, perhaps. So changing the system, we've seen a group, an organisation in Europe called DM 2025. It's a Democracy in Europe movement. That's what the DM stands for. And it was started by one of the driving forces of it was Yanis Varoufakis, who was the former Greek Minister for Finance. And he is a visionary person, I would say, and he and his colleagues have started this movement. It's a political movement, but one that embraces social and environmental change within Europe. So that's one signal. In Australia, I'm looking for signals where environmental and social justice and human rights and peace groups start to form alliances to campaign on a much larger scale. And one of the early signals is the Australian Democracy Network. So democracy is a common theme for environment and social justice and peace and human rights, because democracy is the opposite of state capture by very powerful vested interests. So democracy is a very good common theme to bring together organisations and alliances. Now, the Australian Democracy Network was originally formed by the Australian Conservation Foundation, an environmental organisation, the Australian Council of Social Services, a social justice organisation, and the Human Rights Law Centre, bringing together those three areas, very important areas of social change and social improvement. So that is a positive signal on a large scale. And the challenge remains to bring together all these different community organisations on an even larger scale to exert a very strong force on government. And that is indeed a challenge, but it has to be done. And this was actually pointed out quite some time ago by ex-US President Roosevelt. The story goes that he was meeting with a delegation from the community, and in the end he said, "Okay, you've convinced me. Now get out there and make me do it." And that's really what politics is about, building a strong enough social movement to overcome the resistance generated by very powerful vested interests like the fossil fuel industry or the weapons industry that do not want to change, overcoming those forces by very strong community pressure. And we can look at, of course, in history, the civil rights movement in the United States, which made enormous progress over a period of several decades under one of the great leaders, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr. We can look at the removal of Great Britain as the colonial power in India in the social movement led by Mahatma Gandhi, a non-violent movement, again, a very strongly non-violent movement that ultimately was successful. We can look at the votes for women, which have been achieved in most countries of the world, sadly not all countries, but in most countries, again through enormous effort, in this case over a period of a century or so. We can look at the removal of dictators non-violently in several countries. In the Philippines, the original Marcos removed. In Serbia, Milosevic was removed. And in Argentina, the rule of the generals was eventually removed after they had slaughtered tens of thousands of people in maintaining their dictatorship. So it can be done, but it needs a very strong social movement. And that means bringing together environmental groups, social justice groups, peace groups, human rights groups, trade unions. They all need to work together in alliances. They still have to continue their individual campaigns, of course, but they also need to cooperate. And I'm involved in a small way with an initial attempt to try and bring together a number of groups to form an alliance to tackle several of the tools used by vested interest in capturing the nation state in Australia. We're looking at the revolving door jobs principle, where retiring ministers of government immediately can walk into much higher paid jobs in the industries that they were supposed to be managing when they were ministers. And the revolving door job rotates in the opposite direction as well, where under a previous government of Australia, a coalition government, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff was appointed from a senior member of the fossil fuel industry, the Minerals Council of Australia. And so we see these revolving door jobs where the door turns in both directions, and that has to be constrained. It has been constrained in the past, but somehow those constraints have disappeared. The chains have gone, and that opens the whole thing to corruption, or a much more serious form of corruption that we call state capture. So there is a way forward, but it's a lot of hard work. If we do nothing, then I'm very pessimistic about the future of human civilization on this planet.
Well, I echo that comment there, but again, I think we need to follow the signals that you started to outline there just much more determinedly and much more strongly. I mean, what I took from that, again, fantastic smorgasbord of ideas on the signals side of stuff was we need to reinvigorate, reimagine democracy. Let's remind ourselves that the actual word demos, kratos, power to the people, people power. You know, this is when it is exercised in its actual original conceptual form. What cannot be achieved? Fantastic stuff. And this whole move towards what is some are calling distributive or participatory democracy, where much larger numbers of the public, everyday citizens get much more involved with the decision making in the political process. I think this is an obvious way. You mentioned Varoufakis there, the ex-Greek finance minister. He's done some fantastic books on that sort of topic, and in fact an imaginative book that I read not so long ago, which I'll try and dig out and put a link in the show notes. But now, in closing, Mark, thanks for a great set of suggestions for our audience to think about, pointing to some possibilities for achieving system-level reforms which could move us on to better development paths by 2040. And thanks so much for your thought-provoking comments throughout the interview. Just thinking back quickly, one idea that I'll take away is that idea of that strategy for combining community-led alliances to resist vested interest state capture and coupling that with community-generated imaginative visions to help guide us toward those possible better futures that many of us are hoping for. So thank you very much, Mark. At the end of each episode, I wonder what you, our listeners, our community of increasingly future-literate, imaginative future thinkers, will take away from this episode and our energising journey into visualising possible pathways to better futures by 2040. We would like you to be part of this podcasting experiment in future vision imagination and to help us try to answer a question. Could a podcast series like this help with sparking the shift, the transition we so urgently need toward better, climate safer, properly nature protected, socially and economically fairer future development pathways? Only time will tell if we can answer this question, tied to the podcast's ambitious deeper purpose. In the meantime, we hope you will continue the conversations sparked by this episode in your homes, workplaces, communities, organisations, and anywhere ideas are shared. Perhaps you may be inspired to answer your own future vision questions, such as what could a more desirable, flourishing future in 2040 look like for me and for those around me? Or how might the imaginative tools used in each episode, 2040 time travel, signals of the future, and taking 3 powerful actions, help me reflect, frame, and communicate my hopes for a better tomorrow? If you're enjoying the series, please consider sharing it. And word of mouth remains one of the most powerful ways to grow a podcast audience, and perhaps an online community committed to cultivating flourishing futures. We'd also love to hear from you. What ideas or questions stood out? What resonated or challenged you? You can send us your reflections, comments or questions by email, social media, text or voice message. You'll find contact details via the Hope Incorporated Australia's website and in the episode show notes. We also welcome your suggestions for possible future guests, topics or ways we might improve the format of the series. We see this podcast as a collaborative project, and your input could help shape what comes next. So until the next episode, keep your imaginations active and alive, keep wearing your 2040 Flourishing Futures hats, and please keep sharing ideas about how, individually and together in visionary community, we can use the power of imagination to shift our development pathways toward a truly flourishing 2040 and beyond. My name is Andrew Nicholson, and thanks so much for listening. Hope Incorporated Australia, providing podcasts, research and community educational outreach to help achieve our vision of a society which is sustainable and just, ecologically, socially and economically. For more details on our work, please visit our website at www.hopeaustralia.org.au.